Hi everyone, in this video we're going to be looking at looping in Bubble. Now looping is a fairly contentious issue when it comes to Bubble purely because it can't do it on the front end. Now on the back end, yes, you can run recursive API workflows where you can run processes on large data sets, but in the front end, the app that's running in your browser, if you want to do little calculations where you're iterating over lists and things like this that are quite common in programming generally when you're developing software, Bubble can't actually do it. However, there are plugins that do that and they're very good. There's only one really that is free, so let's have a look at that one in plugins. This is one called ListShifter. It says KarmaWare. It's by a guy called Keith. It's called KarmaWare because he's letting you have it for free. But if you like it and you get some value out of it, send him a donation. There's a link somewhere where you can do that. I love this little sentence that he's got on here, which is that ListShifter adds looping iteration features that Bubble mysteriously lacks, and I couldn't agree more with that. But ListShifter does it, so it's all good. And the way that you handle iterations in workflows with ListShifter is really good. It's a brilliant plugin actually. I mean, the guys and the fact he's giving it away for free up front is pretty awesome. Okay, so let's have a look at the app that we're going to build with this. Let's have a look at that. So well, it is a very basic, simple invoicing app, and so I didn't put any values in for that one. There we go. Socket 1. Let's call that 10 there. Okay, and we can see it's just adding the lines, and we're adding up a total down the bottom there. Let's say we're going to call this one. Okay, and it's just going to keep adding those up, and you can add lines in there. Now, natively with Bubble on the front end, this is quite difficult to achieve. It's not something that you'd load Bubble up and it's just obvious what this does. And the reason being is it's going against the grain a little bit. The way that Bubble wants you to do this type of thing is when you click the plus button, is to immediately go and add that line to your database. Okay, and then the save button at the end really doesn't do a lot. It just confirms what you've got, and what they expect you to do is to just maybe on the database, on your lines, just have like a draft mode that you can then clear out or whatever, and then you go and delete those drafts and things like that. However, what this is doing on the front end here is simply saving it into a custom state list, and then at the end, then it's saving it to the database. It's not touching the database until the very end. Now, like I say, that goes against the grain, so it's quite difficult to achieve. And there are three reasons why it's difficult to achieve. The first one I've already outlined is that Bubble natively just doesn't do looping on the client side. And the second one is the way that Bubble handles data types. So if you imagine all of these items that I'm adding here are ultimately going to be added into an invoice line data type. So let's have a look at that in data. So this is the data that I've got in there. You can see it's linked to an invoice, got an item price, and let's have a look at the fields. Yeah, we can see all the fields in there. So you would imagine that the way that you might be able to handle that would be to actually create an object of type invoice line as a custom state in memory. And then when you add in the lines, just add it to that list, and then at the end, save it to the database. Bubble doesn't allow you to do that. Bubble sort of reserves its data type strictly for dealing with data. So in other words, if you're going to start to say invoice lines item is equal to, then the only way to do that is when you're in the workflow is is to do either create a new thing or make changes to a thing. You can't just set it on a list. So that's the second limitation. So the way that we get around that is by adding each one of these into a native type of data list. So in other words, a text or a number, and create a list of text and a list of number, and that way we can just store them into memory and then save them at the end. Okay, now then we come to the third limitation, which is related to doing it that way. So basically that's kind of like overcomes the first limitation, and then there's another limitation we've got to overcome, and that is that Bubble mysteriously, whenever you've got a list of text or a list of numbers, if you've got a duplicate value anywhere in there, it doesn't allow you to store the duplicate. So when you add a line here, if any of these details are the same, whether it's a description or the quantity or the price or whatever value that you're storing in there, if it's duplicate, it won't add it. Okay, So you're in a situation there where you can't even do it that way. So the way around that, and I'll go through this shortly, is to actually add everything in a single text list. Okay, and there's a command that Bubble offers us that enables us to process this. And the way that I keep these unique is, you can see here I've got a line number of 1, 2, 3, and what I do, I just add that at the front of the text that's being stored in the list, and that guarantees to keep it unique. And then that stores it all in a single text list, so in all of the fields, and then at the end we just save those details in there. So again, we're going against the grain a little bit, so this isn't obvious the way to do it, but this works really, really well. So to get started, what we're actually going to do is we're going to look at doing some basic looping, and I'm going to start with how are we calculating this total here, using loops and iterations with ListShifter to basically look at this list and just iterate over the list to come up with a total whenever you add a new line. Okay, so that's a simple form of looping, so we'll cover that first. Okay, so we're in our Bubble editor, and what we want to achieve here is, we're not going to develop the whole app at the moment. What we want to do is start simple with the looping by simply calculating our total by iterating over these lines. Okay, now like we said before, the way to do that in Bubble is to use the ListShifter plugin. So over here on our visual elements, we've got our ListShifter KW. Okay, and let's pop that on there next to the total box. Okay, and let's just call this ls inv total. Okay, what we need to do is to find a way to iterate over each of these lines and then pop the total that we've added up into there. So we need to loop around each line. Okay, first what we need to do is to tell ListShifter how many lines that we need to iterate over. And obviously we grab this information from how many lines the users put in. Okay, so let's take a look at how we set that up with ListShifter. So data type of list is going to be a number, because what we're going to do effectively is generate a list of numbers based on how many lines have been put in. So we'll scroll down, ignore all that, so we get to generate numeric list options. So what we'll do is make a numeric list. We'll say yes. How many items, we need to get how many items are actually, how many lines are on this list that they entered on the invoice. So what we do there, we've got a custom state that stores all of our lines, and that is in inv lines. Now we'll get to that later on, but let's say for now that we know that that's where the lines are coming from, and then we say count. So in other words, the number of numbers that the ListShifter is going to generate in here is based on how many lines that they enter, based on the core, the source lines count. Okay, we're going to start at 1, we're going to increment by 1. That's absolutely fine, and that's all we need to do with that. The next thing we need to do is to iterate over the lines. Okay, because what we're going to do is, we're going to, for each line, we're going to pick it up and we're going to say what's the line total, and then we're going to add it to the total of the invoice. So, and then we want to display it here in this text label. So what we need to do is to assign that to a custom state so that we know that it's going to display it each time we change it. So let's go in here and let's just, so we have a custom state already set up, which is inv total. So we'll put that in there. We'll format it so it displays correctly with 2 decimal places. Okay, and 1000 separate all just to display it nicely. If we go to the page, we can see that we have a custom state here for inv total, which is a number with a default value of 0. All good. Right, so what we want to do then is, when they click the plus to add a line, they want to add the line obviously, and then we want to go away and then run a loop to calculate this. So we'll go to our workflows, or we can start edit workflow. We can ignore all this, is all stuff that's going on. Okay, what we need to do then is to add another action. Just let me pop this down here, and we'll say add another action, which is to loop around the list. So what we'll do is we will say element actions, and we've got this extra list here now with the ListShifter, which is ListShifter KW, and we want to do is to begin iterate a ListShifter. In other words, begin a loop. Okay, so if you're into software development, you'll know this is kind of like a for loop that we're looping around the items on the list. So what's the element that we want to use as our base iterator, which is the one there that we've created called InvTotal. The other thing as well, when it says list to iterate over, we want to select the original list because we haven't done any processing on it, so it's just the original list that's there. So that's all good. So that will kick off the list. So now what we need to do is to specify a workflow that runs for each iteration. So this will kick it off, and then we want an event that will then run for every iteration. So whether it's 4 items, it will iterate 4 times, if it's 10 for 10 times, etc. So the way we do that, we'll click to add an event, go to elements, and then we've got our ListShifter options here, and a ListShifter iterate from ListShifter. So we'll select that. Again, we'll pick up the ListShifter that we created, and then all we've got to do then is add the actions that we want for each iteration. So the first thing that we want to do is we need to sort of pick up the total of the line that we're iterating over. Okay, now what I'm going to do here is pick that off the list, and don't worry too much about this. We'll go through this in a bit. I just need to get the total off the list, so don't worry too much. We'll explain this later on. So I'm going to pick it off the page, and it's going to be we're going to set a line total, which is here, underscore line total. And again, don't worry too much about what I'm going to pop in here. I'll explain that in a little while. Okay, so I'll get that off the page so it doesn't scare you too much at the minute. So what you can do then is, the next thing we want to do then, we pick the total, we've assigned it into this custom state called underscore line total, and then what we want to do is then add it to the total of the invoice. So we'll go to element actions, set a state, and we will go to the page again, and the custom state is going to be InvTotal, and this time we're going to reference itself because we need to get the value that's already in the InvTotal, and then we're going to say plus, where are we, plus, and then we're going to say we're going to reference the total that we've picked off the line in step 1, which is our line total. Okay, and then for each, these 2 actions will run for each iteration, and then we will get our total added up from the items on the list. Okay, so let's make sure that this is gonna work. Right, so let's just add a line for Sprocket. Let's say there were 3 of those at 4, gives us 12. Okay, yep, it's added up quite nicely. Let's add another one. Let's say there were 10 of those at 7. Okay, and then yeah, we can see that's working perfectly well. So that's basic looping in Bubble using ListShifter. Is we've got our add line, and then we start the loop by begin iterate on our ListShifter that we've defined, and then we have, where are we now? There we go, and then we've got our actions for each iteration of the loop. Okay, so yes, we can do looping with Bubble, no problem at all. So I hope you've got that. Just a quick one on the ListShifter. Again, we just set it to a number. We're going to generate a list of numbers. The number of numbers that we're going to use is based on how many lines, by picking the inv lines, which are the source of the repeating group, and how many are on there is delivered by the count command, and so that way that will work quite nicely. So okay, so we've done our first bit. That if you just want to do basic looping, that's probably enough of what you're going to want to do. If you want to do this type of thing with the invoicing, that's what we'll cover next. Okay, so what I've done, I've created a completely different page with just our layout on there. There's no logic in there at all. There's no workflows. I've completely blanked it out. The only thing we've got is that when you put in a quantity and a price, on the total field, I've just got the calculation that sets it to quantity times by price. Besides that, we're going to start from scratch with this one. Okay, so the main thing we want here is to, when they put in a description, a quantity and a price, is to save that information or put it into memory on a list when you click plus. And the way I'm going to do that is to put all of this information on a text list. Now, how am I going to do that? So let me just show you what this is going to look like. If I just add a text box on here, and what I'm going to do, I'm going to store it in this sort of format. So let's say that the line number is the first thing I'm going to store, so that will be 1 in the first case, and then I'm going to put a comma, and I'm going to separate that. I'm going to put the the description that they enter, and then the quantity, sorry, and then the price, and then the total. So that's what I'm going to store on the list. Okay, so I'm going to store all the values in one single text value that's going to get added onto a lines list. I'm going to separate the values out with a comma. Okay, and that way, because I'm going to store the index of the line as we add them, so the first one's going to be 1 and then 2 and then 3, this is always going to be unique, so therefore we're getting around Bubble's limitation on not storing duplicate values on a list. Okay, so that's what we're going to do. So on our plus, let's see how we do that. So we'll just click this. Now this is fairly straightforward. So what I will do is I will say element action setter state on the page. We don't have any custom states in there at the moment, so I will set one and we'll call this inv line. So I'm just going to set the text first, and then when we've set the text of the data that they've put in, then we can add it to the line. So click create. Okay, so now we need to set the value. So what that will be, as we demonstrated before, what I need to do is to store the line number on there. So the way we get that is we need to look at the list of lines that we're going to have, get the count, and then add one to it. So in other words, at the beginning there'll be no line, so the count will be 0, then we're going to add one to it. If there's one line, add one to it, we get 2, and so we get a unique line each time, a unique line number each time. So okay, the way that we do that is let's reference excuse me, the page. Okay, we haven't got the custom state for the line yet, so we'll add that now. Call it lines. It's going to be text and it's going to be a list. So we'll create that. Then we're going to say count, and then we're going to +1. Okay. And then we need to format it, because the count +1 is going to be a numeric value. We need it to be a text, so we'll need to format that. There's no decimal places. That will do. And then what we need to do is to then add a comma on there to separate it from the rest of the data. So we'll just use the append, and we'll just put a comma in there. Append again to add another value, and this time we're going to store the input descriptions value. Okay, just like we had in here. Okay, so then we need to then do another comma, then the quantity, comma, price, comma, total. Okay, so let's add that there. So value, and then append. I'm going to put another comma in there. Okay, append to that, and then this time it's going to be the quantity as value, and again we're going to need to format this because we need to turn it into a text value, and then we're going to append a comma. So we're just sort of building a string up here that we're going to store on the text that we can add to the lines list. Okay, and then we're going to append again, and this time it's going to be the price. So input price is value. Okay, formatted as, and this time we're going to do that as a 2 decimal places. Okay, and again append a comma. Okay, and append again, and then finally we're going to pop there the total. Okay, value, and again we're going to have to format that as into 2 decimal places. Okay, so we get that as a full string in there. Okay, so it looks a bit sort of long-winded, but it's not really. All that we do in there is to say, okay, give us the next line number, and then we're going to add a comma, then we're going to put the descriptions value, add a comma, put the quantities value, add a comma, then the price, and a comma, then the total, and what we end up with is something that looks just like this. Okay, so what we can do there is, in this total here there's nothing on there, so what I will do, well, we've missed a step. The next step is what we'll do then is we will actually add that value that we've got on in the state of underscore inv line. We'll add it to our inv lines. Okay, so we'll say inv lines. Okay, and then we're gonna point to itself, and then we're gonna say Hopefully we can find it. Plus item, okay. And then we've got to then reference the line that we're going to add. Inv line, okay. Now the plus item is actually usually the problematic bit, because that's the bit that strips out any duplicates. So obviously we're not going to be storing duplicates because of the way we're doing it now, okay. So what we'll do then on the repeating group is we will display the raw data as we've got it, okay, so that we can see that it's adding the lines there. However, the repeating group hasn't got anything on it at the moment, so there's no way to say what data we're relying on. There's no data source. So at the moment we've got it set to a type of number, okay, and the reason being, as we did before, we relied on ListShifter to generate a list of numbers for us that we could then loop around. Well, we're going to apply the same principle to the repeating group, is that we're going to create a list of numbers through ListShifter that will then give us the data source of the lines, which will tell it to show a line for each number that there is in that list. Okay, so we need a ListShifter for that. So over here we will add a ListShifter, put it at the side of the grid so we know what it relates to, and then we can just call that LSInv lines. Okay, and what we will do, that's going to be a type of number. It's going to be exactly the same as we did before, so we can scroll down to generate a numeric type. So that's going to be yes, make a numeric list. How many items? Again, we're going to reference the list, inv lines list, okay, and count, so that we get exactly generates the exact number of numbers of lines that we add to this list. Okay, so now that we've got that, what we can do on the repeating group is we can specify that as the data source. Okay, and remember to always select the original list, because we're not doing any processing on that. Okay, so that gives us our data source for the list. So what we can do here is I'm just going to display the raw text in this particular text box. So I'm going to insert dynamic data, and then I'm going to say that I want loops. I'm going to say inv lines. Okay, now what I need to do then is to refer to the item number, because it doesn't know which line I actually want to display, so I need to tell it. So I'm going to say item number, and just say it's the current sales index. So what that will do then is to show the item number that's in the inv list based upon what the current sales index. So if it's the first line, it will be line 1 and 2 and 3 and so forth. So let's just give that a go. And okay, so let's put in an item. We said 3, didn't we? Okay, and then when we plus it, yeah, so we're getting the raw data there. So if we're not clearing these values, but if I just put in something else, socket at 1 at 10, okay, add that, we can see what's going on here is that we're then adding the items into the line. If I can just, okay, and we can see what's happening there is that we're just getting these lines with the raw data that's being stored. So obviously the next thing that we need to do is to pick these different values off of our list so that we know what to do and so we can manipulate them. Okay, so it's fairly straightforward. There is a command in Bubble that lets us do this. Okay, so what we'll do, I'll just demonstrate how this works. So let's say, for example, in our little text box here that we're going to display our line number in. Okay, so let's see how we get that line number out of that list. So we're going to insert dynamic data, and we're going to pick up the lines, and then we need to pick up the item number, and it's going to be the current sales index, just like we did before. Now what we need to do is going to pick up the specific line number of each line. Is we need to do something different to pop that off that string that contains all of our information, and we use this here, which is a split by. Okay, and what we're going to do is we're going to put the comma, because that's what we separated our data by, and then what we can do then is to say item number is 1. So what's happening there is that when you do the split by, Bubble then creates another list, and each item in the list is the data that's split by the comma. So when we've said item number 1, we know, if we look down here, that that's the line number. So that's how we're able to pop it off, okay? So let's just demonstrate that, and then we'll go through this a little bit further. So, and let's put some dummy data in there, okay? Okay, we get that, and then the next one. Okay, and we can see that it is popping it off the list quite nicely. Yeah, so that's how we're going to display our data. That's how we're going to grab the information when we need to process it, when we need to manipulate it. That's what we're going to do. Well, first, just let's show how split is working. So I'm going to put a repeating group on here. Okay, I'm just going to need to extend the page a little bit. Okay, with our repeating group. Okay. I'm going to need another list shifter for this because, okay, and we're going to do exactly the same thing as we did before. Set the data type of the list as number. We're just going to give it a name, and we'll call this split list. Okay, and we're going to make a numeric list, yes. And the number of items is going to be the number of items that the split creates, which we know is always going to be 5 in this particular case, but we need to make it a bit more dynamic than that. So what we will do then is we will pick the last item off here and tell it to give us the number of items in the split list. So what we can do there is to pick up the loops list, and we will say item number, and we will say, let's say the last item that's been added, which will be Invlines count. So we get the item number there, and then what we'll do then is to split by, and then we can put that in there, and then that's going to create another list, okay, and then we can do count. So what we're saying there is the last item that they add, effectively we are then going to get another list using split, which is then going to have all of our data. So the first one will be the line number, the description, the quantity, the price, and the total, okay, so that we can split them down. Okay, so in here what I will do there is just have a couple of text boxes, a small one and a bigger one. Okay, and we need to set the repeating groups type is going to be a number, and the data source is going to be our last list, our split list shifter. Okay, in there, the original list. So that's going to just create the number of lines as it needs. Okay, so what we can do with that then is is just to say the current sales index. We don't need anything more than that. Okay, so to set the text, what we're going to do, and again, all we want to demonstrate here is pulling the individual values from a list that Bubble creates with split. So what we need to do then is to say, let's pull up the loops, Invlines. Okay, and then we're going to say that it's loops. Hopefully it will. Sorry, item number. And then we're going to pick up loops again, and we're going to say Invlines count. All that does is just make sure that what it displays in this is the last line that you enter up here. Okay, pulling the data down, so that's what that does. And then what we can then say is, again, we're going to say split, which is going to split the text down, the actual text value, into its own list. So we're going to split. The separator is a comma. Okay, and then what we're going to say is the item number is current sales index. Okay, don't worry too much about this. Okay, I'm only doing this to show you how this works. So let's just go ahead and have a go at that. Okay, so let's sprockets, let's say there's 5 of those at 19. Okay, so what I'm showing you here is when you use split, how Bubble creates a list. Okay, it creates its own list of the individual values that we've separated with commas. So therefore item 1 is a line number. So let's add another one just to show that off better. Okay, notice because we said the count, how it pulls in the last item. So therefore item number 1 on the list that split creates is the line number. Item number 2 is the description. 3 is the quantity. 4 is the price. 5 is the total. So what I'm trying to get at here is that the split creates its own list of the values that are split by the comma. Okay, now before we crack on with this and get to the next level, is that I wouldn't ordinarily use commas excuse me, to split these values out. The reason being is that quite easily a description can have a comma in there. Okay, and then to Bubble, when it runs split, it will then split that out, and then you're in all sorts of trouble. So generally you'd use a couple of characters, maybe even 3, but I usually use 2, and make them quite obscure so it's not characters that you would ever use together. Okay, so a common one that I would use is maybe the percentage sign together with the ampersand or something of that nature, or maybe the pipe with the percentage sign, just to make sure that that's never going to get hit as in general text terms. So what we would do then, we'd obviously have to go back to our workflow to change how we save our data. Okay, I wanted to show that in the first place because when we start adding odd characters, it immediately starts to make things look more complicated than they actually are. So all I'll do here, I'll just fill this in and we'll come back with the new separators that I'm going to use on here rather than the comma. Okay, so I've changed all the separators from a comma to a percentage mark and a pipe. It makes it look a bit more complicated, but it really isn't. I've also had to go in and change it in here, and in here as well. So the same thing, and also on the ListShifter, because remember we did the split on there as well. Okay, so like I say, just to reiterate, I started off with commas because it's fairly simple to see that's a separation of data, but you wouldn't use commas as a separator. Okay, so rather than, let's have a look at this one, rather than it look like this, now it's going to look like that type of thing across all of those. Okay, but I'm going to get rid of that because we know what we're doing now. So let's have a look at that. So let's just add a, why not keep it consistent with our sprocket, 10. Okay, and so we can see what's happening here. It's exactly the same thing, it's just we're separating it by a different character set just to make sure that we're not running into any problems. So the main thing I want to highlight is this at the bottom, is that when we run split, Bubble is creating a separate list for us. Okay, so as we start picking items off the text to separate them out into different values, okay, it's important to know that when we pick the list off, we then split it, and then we're dealing with a different list. And then when we're dealing with it, if we want to get the description, we need to say it's item number 2. If it's a quantity, it's item number 3. 10 is 4, and so on and so forth. Okay, we just need to keep a little bit of a track of that, and that's why I always put this there. So I've got an idea of which item, which value I need to be picking off at the time. Okay, so we've already done this with the line number, if you remember. So just let's go through this. So we're saying the lines list, item number, the current cell's index. So we're picking it up whatever cell that we're in, and then we're splitting it by our 2 separation characters. Okay, and then we're saying from that list, from the split list like we had down here is 1, which is the line number. Now if we want to pick off the description, then we need to pick off item 2 off the split. So let's do that. So I'm going to copy this, copy that expression, just clear that, and let's paste this one in. Paste expression. Okay, now this time we need item number 2 because that's the description. Again, just going off this list here, item number 2 is a description. Okay, so then this field here will then now be populated with a description. So let's give that a go. Okay. Okay, there we go. And now we can repeat that to display these in each individual cells, okay, in each individual column. So let's just copy this expression. This is the quantity, isn't it? So we can paste expression item number 3. Okay. So then obviously we'll copy that, and we'll do the same here. Paste expression. This is going to be item number 4, which is the price. Okay, and then item number 5. Okay, so if we then give that a go. Okay, we can see that that's working quite nicely. So we've got all of this working now. We can now add lines into our list. It's quite happy. Obviously we explained how to calculate the total at the bottom, so we won't cover this here. We won't go over old ground with that. Just a quick note, by the way, when we're doing the invoice totals in the previous example, is a couple of steps that were already done for us before we started to do the iteration, which are required. One of those is to set the actual inv total to 0 first of all, just to make sure that by the time you get into the loop, they set to 0, so it's not adding up from previous. That's the first thing. And the other thing as well is make sure that you add a pause before the next action, which you can get from the navigation section in the actions list, and then add a pause before the next action. A very small pause, like 50 milliseconds or something like that. The only reason being is that when we're doing this, and I'm not 100% sure on this, by the way, but I'm surmising that this is why, is that when we're doing this happens so quick, and then we go and iterate around the list to calculate the total, is that the actual update to the list, okay, takes a very brief time indeed. I mean, 50 milliseconds is what, 1/20th of a second, but it just gives you that little chance, I think, for, and I'm surmising this, for the list shifter, which we're relying on, to actually update the count here. So we've added a line to this inv lines list, and it just takes a moment for it to, if you like, bubble up to the top to update that list. So therefore, once this gets reset, then this gets recalculated and the list is regenerated, and you need that to make sure that the new item that's added, so if you had 3 items before and then you add a 4th one, it just takes a little moment just for it to populate here. So if we don't have that pause, even if it's a minor pause, by the way, make sure you tick that, otherwise you'll get the usual bubble sort of progress bar going along the top during the pause. But effectively just a short pause, just to make sure that ListShifter has got a chance to update itself with the count, so that when it's looping, doing the iteration, it knows what to do. Only because it's happened so quick, it just isn't that time for it to do it in the background. Just one quick note on that one. So the last thing that we need to do with this really is to save that information, okay? And it's pretty straightforward, although we have to do it in workflows. But it's similar to what we did here, where we pop in the values off of the list using split to then get the actual values that we want to reference. And we do the same with save. So let's start a workflow on this. Okay. So obviously save, we're going to be using ListShifter again, because we need to loop around the lines that we've done in order to be able to save that. So there's sort of 2 elements to this. One is the looping element to be able to save the lines, and then obviously there's the making sure that we can pop that data, the information, off of each particular line to reference the description, the price and the quantity, and so on and so forth. The first thing that we're going to need to do there is, in our data we have invoice and invoice lines. The first thing we need to do is to just save an invoice, which is an invoice header, which you would normally do. So let's just add an action, data thing, create a new thing. That's going to be an invoice, and there's a couple of things here. Is the number. So what we can do with this is just simply do a search for where are we, invoice, and on here we can just say count plus 1. So if there's 10 invoices on the database, then the next number will be 11. Okay, so another field we can set is the date, which generally you can just set as today's date. Okay, one thing that I always do with dates when I just want to store the date and not the time is I will tend to sort of set these here. So set seconds to 0, set minutes to 0, and set hours to 0, just so it doesn't store it stores a time, but it's kind of a blank time, so the time doesn't get in the way if you're doing date ranges and things like this. Just the way that I do it anyway. So what else have we got? Draft is going to be, no, it's not a draft. Let's have a look, and we've got the lines, which at the moment will be 0. We'll talk about that in a second. Now, if we, in this app, okay, this one that we've built from scratch, we're not doing the total because we did it in the other one. But if it was, then you could set the total on the invoice here to the calculation that we've already made. Obviously, we're not going to do that. So I think that's us done for there. Okay, so we've created the invoice line. Okay, so if you notice on here that there was a field for lines, which is a list of the lines that we're going to store on the invoice. So what we're going to do is we're going to add those up as we're going through the saving, as we're looping through the lines to save. So we're going to save those into a custom state. So we're going to create a custom state on that one. Okay, again, just pop it on the page, create a new custom state, and we will call it inv lines saved. Okay, and this one is going to be of type invoice line. It's going to be a list. Okay, just by initializing it, we're just setting it to blank value. Okay, and then we're going to kick off the iteration, the loop that we're going to do. So what we're going to need to do with that one, for every time that you want to loop around, you do need a list shifter. So what we're going to do with this is just add another list shifter here under the save button. Okay, and it's just going to be the same as the other one. We just let's call it ls inv save. It's going to be a type number, and we're going to make it a numeric list. Number of items, again, is just going to be the number of items that are in our lines list. Inv lines count. Okay, good to go there. So what we can do back in our workflow is we can say element actions begin iterate a list shifter. Select the list shifter, which is going to be inv save, set it to the original list, and then we just need to configure what's going to happen on each iteration of that. Okay, so again, we did this with the other one, so we can just say get a list shifter, iterate from list shifter. Okay, select the inv save, and then we select the actions that we want to happen. So we're going to create the invoice line, so we go to data things and create a new thing, and this is going to be inv line, invoice line. Now this is where we're going to set our fields, so this is where we need to pick things up. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is invoice. Now what we didn't do here on our save is we obviously need to store the new invoice that we've saved somewhere in order to be able to then pick it up in the iteration. So what we'll do here, we'll insert an action and we will set a state, and it's going to be on the page again. We're going to need a new custom state, and this time we're going to call it invoice saved, and this is going to be of type invoice. Okay, and then we're just going to assign the result of step 1 from when we saved the invoice here, and then we've got it there ready to go. So when we go back to our iterator, what we can do when we create the new line for each iteration, we just store that invoice onto the line, so it's linked back to the invoice. So it's invoice saved. Okay, so the next one, let's see what we've got. So now we're just storing these values. So we've got item, which is the description. Now again, we go back to our split. So we've got all of our data on each line in one text, as we've explained before. So then we just pop it off as we need it. So the item is item 2, if you remember from last time. Where do we still have that running? Yep, so item 2 is the description. So what we need to do then is to reference the lines, the invoice lines. Okay, and we need to grab the item number. So the item number that we're dealing with is this iteration, and ListShifter gives us this. When we reference this ListShifters, then we say current iteration index. Okay, and then what we need to do then is to split that, split by. Okay, remember that we used our percentage mark and a pipe as our separator, our data separator, and then we just need to then say item number 2, which is the description. Okay, so what I can do then is copy that expression and set another one. This time we're going to do quantity, and I'm going to just paste that expression in there. It's not liking it so far, and the reason it's not liking that is because item number, okay, item number 2, which is wrong, we need to set that to item number 3, but that is actually a string value and quantity is a numeric value. So we need to, what we need to do then is click more, and we have an option down here which is converted to a number. Okay, so once we've done that, Bubble's quite happy with that. We have to convert it from the string that we get when we pop it off the text, and then convert it to a number. Okay, so what you can do is copy that expression, and we'll go to price, and we can paste that expression in there. This time it's item number 4. We've got the converted to number there. Set another field, which is going to be the total, and we're going to paste the expression in there, and then we just need to change the number to 5. Okay, so again we're just popping the values off of that like we did before to save it. Right, so we've done that, we've saved the invoice, that's all good. So what we now need to do is to save it into our list. So do you remember that when we did the save, we set like a blank inv line saved? We now need to add the line that we just created into that list. So element action set state. Okay, inv line saved. And what we're going to do there is we are going to say we need to add it. We can't just directly assign it, we need to add it into the list. So inv line saved, and then we can say plus item, and then we say result of step 1, which is where we saved the invoice line to. So therefore we're building up a list as we go through with that. Now what we need to do here, and this is recommended because this is going to go to the server when we save this. So before we start running the next iteration, is just to put a pause on it. And this is something that Keith, who does ListShifter, recommends that you do. And Keith is quite keen. If you watch any of his videos, they're not often on YouTube. You have to go in the forum and sort of dig them out. He tends to recommend not doing any data-heavy actions when you're iterating using ListShifter on the front end. Okay, so he's fine with this, just saving however many records on an invoice is never going to be that big a chunk, but he doesn't recommend you start doing things, if you're churning away thousands of records or even hundreds of records. Just don't do it. Do that on a back end workflow. But still, when you're on a front end workflow, it's going to save it, but that's going to take a short amount of time to go to the server and back again. So again, it's just best to put a pause there. It's not really going to affect anything. So we put a pause on there. Let's say the pause is, I don't know, let's say 25 milliseconds. Hide it. So that's only sort of 1/40th of a second. So for every 40 lines you'll get a second delay, but I don't think that the user is going to bother with that. So again, it's just giving it a chance to go to the server, do what it's got to do, and just so that there's no aggro. going on. And by the way, if you do that on a back-end workflow, then you're recommended to do exactly the same thing, is to, for each iteration that you run through, before you call the next iteration of the workflow, is to just put a pause on there. Okay, you could put a bigger pause if you wanted to, but I'll just stick with 25 milliseconds. I'm quite happy with that. And then it's obviously then going to just go to the next one for the next line, and so on and so forth until we've finished. Now at the end then, we need to attach the lines that we've put here back to the invoice, because on our data, if we look at our invoice, we've got a list of invoice lines. So we've been storing them up as we've gone through the iteration. Now we need to assign them back to the invoice. Now we can't do that on here. We can't do it on here because this kicks off the iteration, okay, but then moves straight on. So it's asynchronous. If you've done any JavaScript, it's asynchronous. So you kick that off and then this immediately continues. So if you're going to rely on that finishing, you don't put that there. What you do is you use a different event, which is a ListShifter iteration complete event. Okay, point it to the correct ListShifter, and then what we can do then is to make a change to a thing. And the thing we want to change is the invoice that we saved at the beginning. Okay, and the field that we want to change is, we want to say lines, and we're going to set the list because it's a new list. We don't need to add anything to it, so we set the list, and we can then point to our invoice lines saved, and then that will pop all of those on there. Now when we've completed as well, obviously what we want to do is to make sure that all of our data is cleared, so that we're ready to start entering a new one. So, and the other thing as well is on here we've got like an abandon button, so you might want to, we're going to call that from there. So where you need to call a workflow or a task from more than one place, you'll generally create a custom event. So let's go and do that now. Create a custom event, and we will call that clear invoice. We haven't really got a type of thing. Fairly straightforward. We just clear the lists that we're relying on. So all that we will do is set the state of our invoice lines to blank, so that will just clear it out. If you were storing the invoice total here, as we did in the first example, you'd also have to make sure that got reset to 0, because otherwise that's just gonna set. Obviously when you're running, you won't show that. That's just like a development thing, just to show how the values are split down. Okay, so what we can do then from our iteration complete is run that custom event. Custom events trigger a custom event, and clear invoice, that's going to do that. We can also then pop that on here on our abandon button with a workflow, and we're just going to say trigger a custom event, which is to clear invoice. Right, so I think that we're done at that point. That should save everything we want back to the actual invoice, to the database. So let's give that a whirl. Okay, we will stick with our trusted sprocket. We will have 4 of those at £20 each, or $20, whatever each. Okay, and what we haven't done is cleared this, so let's go and do that now. So that will be on our add line button there, so we can just on here we will element actions, reset inputs. That should do the job for us, hopefully. Sprocket. Okay, that's fine. Sprocket. Okay. Let's just say Crockett. Another 2, £20 or $20, €20, whatever is your preference. So we've got 3 lines on there. So let's now go ahead and save that. Okay, clears it nicely. Let's check our database and make sure that we've actually got those. So invoices, Yep, there we go, and it's saved all our 3 lines. Invoice number 16, which is one more than 15. Okay, and then on our invoice lines, there we go, sprocket, spricket, crocket. Now what we're not doing is saving the line number, which you could obviously do. You could have a line number field on there, and then that will do the job. But effectively, that's working quite well for us. Just one quick note on looping, and this is something that's important, because you may do all of this and find it's not working, okay? And usually that is because you've got the debug mode going. So generally speaking, if you've got sort of the debug mode going here, remember this ListShifter is not part of Bubble, it's a plugin, okay? And maybe that's why they don't support looping themselves, because then they'd have to support it through the debugger. The debugger, if you're in debug mode, it absolutely freaks out about using looping iterations. It just can't keep a track of what you're doing because you're iterating around. So just be aware of that, that if you're running that in debug mode, what we've just shown you there will not work, okay? So you have to sort of take that off the URL when you preview it, and just make sure you're not running it in debug mode. I don't know anybody that uses debug mode to any great extent these days, to be honest with you. But if you're using it in test without the debug mode, it's fine. If you run it live in production mode, it's fine. It's only a problem when the debugger in the background is trying to keep track of your iterations. That's when it becomes a problem. Okay, so I think we're pretty much done. I hope that's covered everything. I hope I've not lost anyone. I hope I've repeated myself often enough that that's not the case, which I do tend to do, and I apologise. But hopefully that's been useful. I did make a previous video about looping in Bubble. It wasn't very definitive. I will do more videos on this subject, because there are other ways that you can achieve this besides what I've done. Maybe not in the same way, but certainly if you want to make sure that you are allowing the user to put information in, multiple lines of information in, no matter what the subject is, in memory, and then just have it touch the database at the end, this is a great way to do it. And certainly split by is a real lifesaver in terms of that, the way that you can just chunk that data down. You can store it in one text line, stick an ID at the front to make it absolutely sure it's going to be unique, and then split each value down so you can read it very, very easily, just like we did when we were saving the data. It's actually, where are we? On the iteration, wasn't it? Yes, there we go. As we did here, we can just pop each item that we've stored in that text list into there, so that's a lifesaver for us. Okay, so I hope you've enjoyed this one. I hope you've got some value out of it. If you have, please like the video, because that helps Google's YouTube algorithm pop the video higher so that more people can see it. If you're really enjoying any of the content I put out, and I will be putting lots more out, please think about subscribing as well. Again, that all helps. By the way, when you're watching this, if an advert popped up at the beginning, I don't know if you know how YouTube works these days, but I don't get paid for that, okay? So don't blame me that there's adverts on there, that their terms and conditions are that even channels that are not getting monetized, like mine isn't getting monetized, still get adverts, and we just don't get the money. Google gets the money. So don't blame me if adverts pop up. But anyway, listen, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Really appreciate your time, and take it easy.